What's up YouTube? My name's Karen and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew stretch fabrics. More specifically for today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to sew a pole costume, but that can cross over into dance, aerials, acrobatics, circus, whatever it is. The reason I started sewing is so that I could teach myself how to sew myself training wear or performance wear, basically anything involving stretch fabric, so that's kind of where I started. So when I was looking for resources online, I couldn't really find anything on YouTube. There were a few here and there, but none that were specifically for like dance wear from scratch. So I thought this would be a really fun video to make and, update YouTube with some stretch tutorials. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. And just as a side note, I did record this entire video in autofocus and I should have been recording in manual, but I was halfway through the video when I realized my mistake, and at that point it was too late to turn back, so then I just kind of kept recording with autofocus. So this entire thing goes in and out of focus and it's blurry and whatever. It's not terrible, but it's not great. So please forgive me. And yeah, let's get into the tutorial. Alright guys, first things first, I always take my patterns out of my handy dandy pattern drawer, which is full of base patterns that I've drafted in the past. Most pole costumes revolve around the same few base shapes, so what I usually do is grab the patterns that are the same shape as the design I'm intending to make, and then I'll hack them to make any changes necessary for that design. In this case, I'm adding a mesh cutout into the top, which you'll see me do in a bit. At this point, I have my base halter pattern traced onto my paper, and this is where the hack comes in. As you can see, I'm drawing the shape of the cutout, which I will literally cut out with my rotary cutter later. When you do cut your patterns, be sure to cut in one swift motion to avoid any jagged edges, and be sure to keep the piece you cut as you'll need it for later. I also decided that I wanted to bring the back of the halter top down lower, which is what I'm cutting out here. I had a pre-existing pattern that would fit the person I'm making this for, and it didn't require any changes. So now that all my pattern pieces are ready, it's time to cut them out of your chosen fabric, which in this case is this gorgeous burgundy lycra. All you need to do is place your pattern face up on the right side of your fabric, which is the side that has your preferred finish, pin it or weigh it down with whatever you got lying around, and then cut it out. To bring back the cutout pattern piece. Instead of lycra, we're replacing this pattern piece with nude mesh to give the illusion that there's nothing there. Again, place it on your fabric and cut it out. For all mesh cutouts, make sure to leave about a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the inside edge that connects it to the existing pattern. You'll see why in a sec. Now, take your top and overlay it onto the mesh piece. Everything should line up to create a full halter pattern. Your 1/2 inch seam allowance should be sitting behind the lycra. Once you're happy with it, pin everything in place to prep it for sewing. Next up is lining. If your pattern doesn't have mesh cutouts, you can spray your lining fabric with 505 spray, which is a temporary adhesive or basting spray to hold the 2 layers together. Discovering this spray honestly changed my life. Instead of having to pin the 2 layers together and run a basting stitch around the edges, you can just spray and boom, that's it. Then all you have to do is cut around your pattern. If your pattern has a mesh cutout like my top does, I prefer to lay the pattern on the top of the lining and cut it out separately. Here I'm just cutting out strips of fabric that are 4 inches and 3 inches in width for the neck, bust, waist, and leg bands, which we'll get to later. In order to stitch the Lycra onto the mesh, I sew right along the edge where the 2 fabrics meet using a zigzag stitch set at a width of 2.5. As you can see, my mesh seam allowance is on the wrong side of the fabric, which I'm now going to enclose in my lining. Simply place the lining on top of your Lycra, pin it in place, and again zigzag along the edge where the 2 fabrics meet. I prefer to use a wider stitch for this part. You will have 2 lines of stitching along the edge, but we're going to be applying appliques later, which will cover this anyways. After I stitch the lining in place along the top, I will 505 the rest in place, but sadly, I ran out of my 505 spray and couldn't get more since I live in Canada, and we had like a crazy blizzard and I couldn't get out of my driveway, so I went old school and quickly basted the edges together. Next up is 1/2 inch elastic to finish the side edges of the halter top. I just place the elastic along the edge, fold over once, and do a wide zigzag along the edge, set to a width of 4.5. I want to be sure that my zigzag is overlapping where the edge of the elastic meets the Lycra to ensure the edges don't roll outwards. As I sew elastic, I like to give a small tug every now and again to ensure I maintain good tension throughout. Next, I took the 4-inch bands that I cut earlier, folded them in half, and did a narrow zigzag along the raw edges. I then placed one at the bust line and one at the neckline with right sides together, and I did a zigzag stitch to hold them in place. Once I had these stitched in place, I took them over to the serger to finish off the edges. I prefer to use my machine first and then serge just because I think it gives a really clean finish to my seams. Here I'm adding 1-inch clasps to the neck and back of the halter, folding the fabric that went through the clasp hole inwards and using a straight stitch to secure it. Moving on to the bottoms, all I'm doing here is folding my pattern horizontally so it's right sides together, and I'm stitching the sides using a zigzag stitch. Then I take it over to the serger and I finish off the edges. Now I need to finish off the leg holes. Typically, I would take the same elastic and technique I used for the top. However, this costume is for a competition that has strict requirements in terms of coverage, and I found that adding a band like I did for the waist is the best way to add coverage without getting camel toe. All I'm doing here is taking one of the 3-inch bands I folded in half and facing it right sides together with the bottoms along the leg holes. As I zigzag it in place, I keep the band nice and tight to maintain tension to ensure a nice clean seam. Again, after I finish sewing both in place, I take it to the serger to finish it off. Initially, I cut the bottoms to be high-waisted, but realized I wanted them to be a lower rise, so I just placed a pin for where I wanted them to sit, which I eventually cut across. I then took one of my bands, folded it in half lengthwise along that line, and pinned it so I knew where to sew it together for the waistband. As I did for all of the other bands, I'm placing the waistband and the bottoms right sides together with the seam of the waistband facing up and stitched it with a zigzag. I'm just placing a pin on either side of the side seam for the bottoms and the waistband to make sure that the side seams line up with each other. On to appliques, which was the most time-consuming part of this project. Most of the time I'll buy applique or lace in these panels, which I then cut around using a small pair of scissors. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I try and get nice and close to the edges. Onto my dress form. Her name is Scarlett, by the way, and I start to pin them in place using straight pins until I'm satisfied with the layout. Time to stitch these bad boys down. What I like to do is take my needle and thread and bring my first stitch through the back side so my knot is hidden. Then I bring my needle to the outside of the applique, pick up a small amount of fabric, and then bring it back through the underside of the applique. I'm not a super sewing aficionado by any means, but I believe it's called a whip stitch. Finally moving on to the final step, which is my absolute favorite, the bling. For this costume, I used a mix of crystal, which I applied directly onto the appliques, and then black crystal and Capri Gold, which I used on the lycra. I thought I was also going to use Crystal AB, but I ended up changing my mind, and I'm really glad I did. My favorite method for applying crystals is to put E6000, which is the glue I use, into a syringe, pick up my crystal with a pair of tweezers, apply a small dollop of glue, and then place it on the costume. Sadly, I ran out of syringes and couldn't go get more, so in this case I just put some glue onto my mat and swiped up some glue on the back of my crystal using a pair of tweezers. As I was working away with my crystals, I realized I wanted to add 2 small straps to the back to really tie it all together, which I quickly did off camera. After applying crystals to my heart's content, this is how the completed costume turned out.